and welcome to the Imelda MarCAST. Our guest today is a solo artist and composer. He also plays in the band Psalm Zero, and he's also played in the bands Extra Life and Z's. Today we're talking to Charlie Looker. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
How have you kept busy in the fine year of 2020?
Well, I got the when COVID hit, it was right in the middle of a tour with Psalm Zero opening for KO. And so we had to hightail it home from Miami after a week. So yeah, since then, all these tours have been canceled. I've been writing, stuff that's going to be the new Psalm Zero. And I've been going deep with this YouTube channel. That was kind of like the main new thing, is that I'm a YouTuber now. So it's like I'm going to start uploading this stuff as a podcast as well, but it's like
Cool.
Live streams with different musicians like we're doing right now. And like talking about philosophy and music and cultural criticism stuff, in this vein, the YouTube-y vein. Hopefully a little higher brow than your average YouTube.
I'm just going to say, it sounds like there's a lot more substance than the typical YouTube fare of, I'm cooking a thing and I'm wearing like sexy yoga pants.
Yeah. Well, there's that. And then there's this sort of, a lot of what passes for musical and cultural and artistic, thought, thinking. A lot of what passes for thought, period, on YouTube is just really low quality, which is kind of what made me want to do it. Made me want to start a YouTube channel more than a podcast, because I like the idea of being in this realm that's sort of admittedly kind of schlocky, So that, that's been cool. I've just enjoyed that's something I probably wouldn't have even thought I would do or take seriously like a year before. Not being able to play live, obviously writing music, it's it's an everyday discipline, or almost every day, it's but with literally nothing else going on except for teaching Skype or Zoom guitar lessons, and no gigs. I've got plenty of time to write music and
So let's start at the beginning. So do you consider guitar your first instrument?
Yeah, I played piano when I was a little kid. But yeah, I started guitar when I was 11. That's not, at this point, I write on guitar, write on the keyboard, and I also write just in my head and also on the page, so these are all kind of, as far as writing now, it's like all those different instruments, but as far as performing, I'd say I'm a guitarist more than a vocalist, but I would say vocalist close second, as far as the instrument goes. Yeah.
So when you started playing guitar, what bands were you into? Like, what bands inspired you to pick up a guitar in the first place?
Metallica pretty much was the one. I had seen Metallica t-shirts around on like the cool looking older kids. And I had just gotten into music, period, just through listening to stuff on the radio. And then, but I had this sense that there was stuff that you couldn't hear on the radio. You just see those shirts, as a little kid, and they're dark, you're into horror movies already. They have this sort of horror aesthetic, the pus head art, so I was just really curious about that. And I just got my parents to buy me And Justice for All. Yeah, I think it really was hearing that. I think it really was actually just hearing Metallica, and then I started to get into buying tapes and stuff. And pretty soon after that, it was like Metallica, Megadeth, and then Slayer. It's like the big four. Pretty much. Yeah. This was like early '90s. When I was like 11 years old, and then and I got a guitar teacher, and he got me into all this stuff like classic rock and whatnot. Yeah.
What do you think is your favorite Metallica record? And I ask because like I also started playing guitar because of Metallica, so. And this has come up in a prior episode, so I'm curious to see, what do you think is the best Metallica record?
I love that that's a running thread in your show, and I can hop on this. I'm actually going to say Justice. It's actually Justice. Despite I know the mix is like notoriously bad, it's Justice, man. I suppose Puppets is more like consistent or whatever, but just the songs. Just the title track and Blackened and Dyer's Eve kind of just make that album better. than the other ones to me, you know, even though maybe Puppets like is more consistent across, you know.
I grew up on heavy music, and I guess I would consider myself a metalhead. And I've noticed among other people who grew up in heavy music that the progression, like you said, like it starts with Metallica, and then you go to like Megadeth and Slayer, and then it seems like it becomes this quest to find things that are noisier and more extreme, not just metal, but like for me, it led to like free jazz and improvised music and like weird electronic shit. Is that the same trajectory for you?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that's a good way of putting it, that it's like, yeah, you want more extreme stuff. And so then, right, you check out more and more extreme metal, but there's other ways to be extreme, right? So yeah, like free jazz. Yeah, like I got into jazz, my guitar teacher, you know, completely, he was turning me on to jazz just as a player. But then, yeah, it's same thing. It's like once you get into jazz, I'm like, oh, well, what's up with free jazz? What's up with the extreme forms? Same with classical music. You know, my dad kind of got me into classical music. Once you hear Shostakovich, you're like, well, what if that one dissonant moment we're taken to an extreme and we're an entire piece, you know, you want to, you know, it's like there may be something unhealthy about that, because, you know, it's like you see some horror, you get desensitized, you want to see the worse horror, you know, pretty soon you're like yeah, I don't know, yeah, there's something wrong with you. But no, I mean, yeah, like no, it was cool to look at the other episodes that you had. I mean, it was like, yeah, I mean, it was like proggy stuff, complex rock stuff, but no, you know, noisy stuff. It was cool. It's a cool like niche, you know, that you have going. I hadn't really seen that in like other podcasts. I hadn't seen another show that was kind of like mining that particular niche. I was like, yeah, that's very cool.
Oh,
You know,
thanks.
you had the guy from US Mail on there. Is that Shippey you had on?
Yeah, Mark
Was it,
Shippey.
was it
Yep.
Mark Shippey, or I can't remember which. Huge band for me, US Maple. Obviously years later. I mean, you know, but this is like when I was
Yeah,
20 and
same.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Super important band. I love them so much. Yeah.
Yeah, and fingers crossed, I will talk to Todd Rittman. Hopefully, I have to follow up with him, but that would also be a big deal for me because like Dead Rider is also such an excellent band, and I would just love to get in his head and see what his process is. You know?
Yeah, I actually weirdly have not really checked out Dead Rider. I saw them I saw them play like years ago and I was like, man, this is awesome. But then I just for some reason never like followed up really in bed. That's one of the greatest shows out there. It's like, I don't know, just for my own personal taste and just, yeah, like how they threw down on stage. Yeah, I think metal, it's a cool it just starts you on this I mean, complexity, really, compositional complexity. Even though, you know, you don't think of Metallica, you know, Metallica and Megadeth. I mean, it's like obviously, you know, compared to like later, you know, get into like whatever, like Death or like Dillinger Escape Plan or just, you know, a death metal or something, you know, compared to that, obviously it's not hyper complex music, but compared to just rock music, you know, or compared to just old school heavy metal, it's highly technical music, you know, very complex. Metallica and Megadeth. So then it leads to, yeah, something like US Maple, whereas different kinds of complexity. Did you interview Sean from Yowie? Was
Yes,
that
yes, I did.
or one of the Yowie guys? Or no? Was that?
I talked to Sean
Yeah.
and Chris Troll, who was in Yowie. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, that's Yowie are so great. That's the intro music for the show, right? Is Yowie?
Oh, no, that's actually my band. But I mean, as a huge
Wait,
Yowie
can you
fan,
hear
I
me?
take that as a compliment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, yeah, it's only like a thing of it. It sounded great. I'll have to check out your stuff. You send me some links. But yeah, Sean, it's funny. Yeah, we stayed at Sean's house on
Cool.
that Psalm Zero KO dot tour, like right as Corona was starting to. Yeah, I mean, but we were having all. It was such a bitch, that tour, because it was already just utterly cursed. Like before even Corona, we had like three different serious van problems. They're like totally unrelated, you know, just breakdown. We missed this show in Tennessee that we were supposed to play with Today's the Day. Like I was so bummed I had to just put it out of my mind and like pretend that it just didn't even happen, because like I was so hyped to play with Today's the Day. You know, it's like one of my favorite bands ever. Yeah, so we were basically stranded at Sean's house for like 3 days, and we were supposed to just be there for one night. But he's such a cool guy, and he has a really nice house. He's a therapist, you know. So we talked about psychology and philosophy and stuff. He's so cool. I love him. And yeah, we were great. So I don't know. Yeah, like that's definitely, yeah, that scene definitely is where I kind of was rooted in the 2000s and stuff. Wait, Chris Trull. I may be getting Chris Trull mixed up, because I thought Chris Trull was the drummer of Grand Ulena, who died. Is that a different Chris though? Right? I'm getting confused here.
So Chris Troll, he played guitar in Grand Ulena. The drummer was Danny McClain, and he did indeed pass away. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was an unsung band. I mean, that's like, was tremendous. Um, as far as, yeah, I mean, just like that generation of just hyper technical stuff.
Were you also into Dazzling Killmen back in the day?
Yeah. In the Face of Collapse was really, yeah, like in high school, I was turned on to that.
Yeah,
Pretty
that
crazy.
band seems to be like core to a lot of people who end up doing like weirder, heavy music. There's something about like those early St. Louis bands that were really important to people.
Yeah, like Craw, you're thinking maybe also, is that, or were they were St. Louis, right? Or no, they were Columbus. I'm getting mixed up.
I'm less familiar with Crow. I know the name, though. I think
Right?
like
Craw?
Hydra Head put out some of
Yeah.
their records, maybe.
I think so. There, yeah, you would probably really like Craw. Anyway, but yeah, like yeah, I think Dazzling Killman is like that. Well, because yeah, it's like I was into metal, but then also hardcore, which I wasn't so much of a punk type guy, but I was into things around punk, and hardcore, like tougher hardcore that had metal aspects. Um, and just like being from New York, there's this sort of like the New York hardcore kind of
Ah, yeah.
tradition where it gets kind of more metallic, but there's that chugga chugga thing and slams, and there's this kind of breakdowns and stuff. So then, yeah, it's like Dazzling Killmen. Yeah, that kind of stuff where it's like techie and compositional. It has sort of composer aspect to the complexity, but then there's that toughness. Not without being ignorant, so called. But just a sort of hardness that kind of seems like it maybe comes out of hardcore to some extent. Moshable, music or whatever.
Did you ever show up at like those New York hardcore shows wearing like a basketball jersey? Like the stereotypical uniform?
No, I was never in it like that. I'd go to CB's hardcore matinees though, for sure. My emo band in high school played one of those hardcore matinees. Yeah, I definitely went to CB's, Coney Island High and Wetlands and stuff. But yeah, I was never, I guess because this was 90s, so I was more catching that later wave of like post quicksand kind of bands, that sort of you know what I mean, that kind of like came out of that, like had the original roots in like the Youth Crew kind of jerseys and tougher vibe, but then it had that emo-ish, a little bit more just a little bit less like overtly tough, but still with that kind of drumming and that kind of metal-ish riffing, that still has there's something still, it's still hardcore, it's post-hardcore, but it still has a hardcore element to it, as opposed to metal, it's like hardcore that has metal aspect. There's something somehow kind of different than that. Those bands that it's just like stuff that Metallica or a band like Metallica just does not have, like this sort of type of heaviness, that
So you studied music at Wesleyan, right? And so how did you know that studying music at the college level was the right thing for you?
Well, I was by the end of high school, I was getting really into classical music, or I was starting to get into like modern classical music, and not really so much like actual Mozart and like common practice era European music, is really more like post-war, like Xenakis and Stockhausen, and the kind of stuff that you get into through being an extreme music person in general, And I was getting really into free jazz, and I just and I just decided, I was like, I'm going to do this for my life. I didn't know exactly what channel, what avenue. It still changes, honestly. Just what the path is. The path is made by walking, as they say. But well, it was sort of, but for me though, I mean, Wesleyan is more of a liberal arts college than a music school, it's not a conservatory, like you don't learn, I mean, you get a BA with a major in music, but it's not like a classical composition program or a jazz program, you don't get a master's in music. What you study there, it's the sort of multicultural kind of grab bag, a little bit of Indian music, a little bit of West African drumming, a little bit of classical music. So I didn't really actually think of, I actually didn't really think of it as going to school for music,
Okay.
actually, because it was between that and like a music school like Manhattan School of Music, or like one of the like an actual conservatory. So to me, I was kind of like, oh, I'm actually just opting for like normal person college, and I'm just going to try to study music as much as I can within this kind of more like liberal artsy kind of intellectual environment. I loved Wesleyan though. I mean, it was great. I mean, the cool thing is, Anthony Braxton was there.
I was going to ask you that.
So do you check out Braxton much?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that was what's cool. So it's like on the one hand, yeah, right. I mean, it's just like it's a whole world, right? I mean, once you get into Braxton, it's just a whole, I mean, yeah, I sort of So yeah, on the one hand, I'm saying that Wesleyan was kind of like this. It's like on the one hand, I'm making it sound like this unrigorous, not really a music school, liberal arts place. But then you've got Braxton there, who's bringing his super rigorous, presence and study. It's super rigorous in his coming from his particular standpoint, his particular place. And so I learned a ton. I learned a ton from him about his music. I mean, that's what he's mainly great at immersing you in, And then through his music, I learned about stuff that I had no idea about, like John Cage, Morton Feldman, Earl Brown, that generation, the New York school, and Stockhausen, and sort of the big thing at Wesleyan was like sort of alternative notations, really dealing with different ways of notating music differently, which is, it's like very much like a post-war European thing, and also an American avant-garde thing, and then also an African American thing, when you're integrating, like from Braxton's generation and roots, the AACM, where you're bringing in improvisation and composition. I mean, there's a lot I learned from Braxton, and I learned there that like is not present in my. It's just not really a part I do. It was like a huge part of where I've been, and a huge part of what I love. I'd say, I mean, actually, jazz and improvised music in general is a thing that is a big part of me, but doesn't show up in most of what I do,
Mm-hmm.
Some of it kind of, but yeah. I mean, most, what I do, what I do, like notation wise, I basically use almost entirely just normal Western notation, 5 lines, treble clef, bass clef, But yeah, the Braxton thing, it really did open me up, man. I mean, he really, he's a genius. I've been returning to him too, because I hadn't really thought, I maxed out on Braxton so hard in college. I kind of for years hadn't really returned to him. And then just this past year, I've been digging back into his whole archive, and I did a YouTube video that was like Beginner's Guide to Anthony Braxton, where I was trying to lay out all of his music for someone who'd like never checked him out. I think I did it justice, but it's hard to with, given his body of work. But yeah, Wesleyan was cool for sure.
So like, given that, so I don't know much about graphical notation, but given that it's relatively like arbitrary compared to standard notation, like what are the primary organizing principles for how graphic notation should be used?
Of course, the smart ass academic answer is like, well, all notation was always graphic notation, and there's no difference. But my answer, because I know what you mean. It's it depends on what we're talking about, depends. I mean, if you, well, in Braxton's case, you're dealing with like totally traditional notation, and then you'll have these little tangents and like portals that you can go off to on the page that link up to symbols that represent certain types of improvising. Like he'll have a symbol for play a bunch of staccato notes, improvise only with staccato notes, or another thing that's improvise only with trills, so this would be like, one of Braxton's 8 million ways. You could have some people do stuff, and Braxton does some of this, where you would literally have a shape, a curved, like a curved oblong, just some kind of shape, and then you would trace that, play gestures, play lines, licks, things that are contoured with the ups and downs of that shape, tracing rising and falling lines, stuff like that. I mean, a lot of the stuff at Wesleyan that people would get into a lot of stuff that was conceptually interesting, but really didn't end up sounding cool. And I sort of thought was a little bit, sometimes it would get kind of silly with the grad students and stuff, but a lot of the time it'd be like developing some system, like, like just being like, people come up with their own system, every time you have can't really think of an example off the top of my head, you know what I mean? But like this line rising and falling represents volume, and this other line rising and falling represents pitch or something. And then you've got these two lines intersecting in some crazy way, and you have to like interpret that. But I mean, the stuff that really rubbed off on me is stuff like Earl Brown. He'd have stuff where like different people are playing different stuff that's not really synced up. Like you're not really deliberately syncing it up with other people, but all combined, these sort of unsynchronized sounds sort of rub up against each other in different ways that create these really complex sounding results without having to do a bunch of complex processes, you know? It'd be like if I have to, like the like if the flute is playing like a long note and then a pause and then a little trill and then a long note and a pause and a little trill, and they're repeating that. And then someone else is playing one really loud blast and then a space. You have those two people doing that on their own, but at the time it ends up sounding like this really complex, worked out thing, with long notes and trills and blasts, but you don't have to actually compose the details of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Did you ever get into the
like Earl Brown would describe that as sorry, go ahead.
Please continue about Earl Brown. I'd cut you off.
Oh no, just real. Oh yeah, no. I think there's a time delay here, right?
Yeah,
there is some kind
yes,
of
there is. Yeah,
time delay. There's
a little
definitely a time lag. We're musicians. We'll get the rhythm.
Yeah, we'll feel it out.
But no, like that Earl Brown thing. I mean, he would describe that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he describe that as like a mobile, like those things that hang where you've got like three different little things like looking like wind chimes, and the wind blows. So you're looking at the three different little things hanging down from different angles depending on how the wind blows it. So you're seeing these things kind of against each other, but they're but it's just the wind that's sort of changing how they are configured. Yeah, that's Earl Brown. That's something that rubbed off on me for sure.
Like, how much did you get into the compositional processes of Xenakis? For example, like back in the day, I remember borrowing one of his books from the library that was his dissertation, and I have like a bit of a statistics background, yes, but none of his stuff makes sense to me. So like, did you ever try to get into that and like pick it apart, understand it?
Yeah. I had the exact same experience as you did with that exact book. You're talking about formalized music, I assume.
Yes,
right?
I believe that's it.
Like his defense of his PhD dissertation. Yeah, I still have it on my shelf. I have zero background. I'm not a math person at all. I mean, I'm not terrible at math, but it's just not really where my head is at. Zero experience with statistics. But I was just so blown away by the sound of Xenakis's music. It was just so, I mean, really, really blew me away when I heard that. And that was right at the beginning of college. So yeah, I tried to check that out. I mean, I'm sure it does add up. I'm sure if you really crunch the numbers, it does add up. I love that post-war kind of stuff though, because it's like with Xenakis, it's like you're talking about music where the processes that it's based on are so formal. I mean, obviously they're just so mathematical, completely coming from this intellectualized to the point of, I mean, that's not human at all. I mean, that is numbers, statistics, and shapes, completely inhuman, formalized, constructed, and yet the final result has all of the horror, all of the horror and just terror and fear, of the human experience in the 20th century and World War II and after it, and Europe's just ruination, and all the existential, the existential horror and void that came from just grappling with what happened, Yeah, I mean, not just the Holocaust, but communism as well, and Xenakis. I mean, I talked about this in one of my videos. I mean, it's like hardcore math. I mean, it's nerd stuff, but this guy's walking around with half of his face blown off in war, So I mean, it's like the most inhuman and the most human expression of like the 20th century. I could go on, but yeah, Xenakis is heavy. Writings I couldn't really grok because of the math. Stockhausen's writings about music, though, I can feel that. I got into him, reading him, for sure, and his music itself.
So, like, talking about Xenakis, do you think that art is almost always a function of history then? Does that make sense? Like, that the post-war movement could never have happened if it wasn't for the atrocities particular to World War II.
Question, man. I mean, yeah, I can't say that I have some kind of really clear view of how history works. You know what I mean? But I did. But yeah, the way I just talked about that presented a view of how history works, where yes, where external conditions and material conditions determine what happens culturally. You know, which is sort of, I mean, you could call that Marxist view of history, even though I wasn't really talking about economics. I didn't say anything about economics, but it's a sort of Marxist or sort of left ish interpretation, because I'm talking about the things that are materially happening that determine history, as opposed to a sort of great man kind of theory of history, right? Which you know, just this sort of I don't know, I've been reading Thomas Carlyle lately with, you know, it's a little bit, and you know, his view of history is just that great men erupt and make it, you know, like it's less about conditions, you know, and it's just about great individuals, like, you know, erupting through history, you know. And when I think about history, I don't think of it that way. I think about this kind of heroic individualism when I think about, you know, myself or people that I admire or whatever. But when I think of the word history, I think of zeitgeisty kind of stuff, you know, like, sort of collective consciousness, you know, collective cultural,
So
shared ideas, you know.
Yeah. So, like, as a follow-up question, what do you think was happening in the zeitgeist when the early minimalists like Terry Riley and like Philip Glass were starting out? Like, what inspired that idea to pursue repetition?
I'm sure you probably have a ton of thoughts and knowledge about this on your own, but I know you want to hear me talk about it. I mean, a lot of that stuff was very reactionary against complexity of that post-war European music. I mean, this is the impression that I get from what I remember people telling me about it. I mean, you know, to the extent that I'm not a musicologist or a music historian, but yeah, what I've read about minimalism and my sort of understanding is that it was in many ways a reaction against that complexity, a certain reaction, I think, against the sort of hyper intellectualized, you know, the whole Xenakis factor, you know, of structures and serialism, very much a reaction against serialism. I mean, it's several years later, obviously, but you know, after serials get this sort of going deeper and deeper at integral serialism and this sort of, you know, serializing every aspect. So yeah, I mean, it's a reaction against that, and I also think of it as very American. You know, I think of their you know, you're talking about Terry Riley, Glass and Reich. You know, I think of there probably being a certain kind of thrust, the sort of desire to have a distinctly American avant-garde music, you know, even though there had already been plenty of, you know, distinctly American avant-garde, you know, Charles Ives or whatever. Because minimalism, it's not just the repetition, right? It's also that it's very tonal, you know, or modal, very consonant. So it's not just simplifying form and rhythm. It's also simplifying like pitch and harmony. It's funny, you know, I have to say, I'm really not a huge fan of American minimalism. I really just am not. I mean, out of all of it, I like Glass probably the most, but I really don't. I've never really cared that much about Steve Reich. I used to listen to music for 18 musicians when I would go to sleep at night or just to relax, which is, I mean, that's not probably what somebody, you know, a hyper serious composer wants to hear or what they're thinking about. But I just, like, I hear that piece and I'm like, can I get one dissonant note? Like, it's really like, I mean, there's something deeply like conservative about it. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, I mean, there's something, yeah, it's funny. I mean, there's something conservative about like being like, yeah, you have to use mathematical structures to generate the most alienating modernist music you possibly could. I mean, there's something you could call that sort of conservative because it's just so anal. I think there's something very conservative in a not cool way about this sort of the obsessive simplification. I mean, Glass I like because he gets into some of that. It's like a little more chromatic. It's not just like all one mode the entire time. There's this sort of color to it. And also, I'm not a completist on like really knowing all of Reich's stuff, so I may be a little ignorant about what I'm talking about. But yes, that music in general, not a big thing for me. As far as American avant-garde, it's really Feldman for me. That's really for me like the king of the United States in the 20th century.
That was a fun tangent. So
yeah.
When you got out of college, I guess how much time was there between that and working with Z's?
That was pretty much overlap. I met Sam Hilmer, who you might know Sam, right? I mean, he's sort of the founder of Z's, and I met him. I left school for a year after my freshman year, so this was this is 20 years ago now. When I was 20, this was 2000, and I had taken a year off of school, and I was just working at an office and playing around New York, mostly like free jazz kind of stuff. And I had this metal band as well. Yeah, I met Sam through some Wesleyan people, and he was booking a show at regular shows at this bookstore on in Williamsburg before that was even really a place, when it was just barely a place with like hip bookstores and stuff. Yeah, and he was like, I'm putting together this stuff to make the most complex. he was basically like, we are going to make hyper complex, and he described it in this mission statement way, where it was like a predetermined concept for what this was going to be. And so I was like commuting into the city. It's like an hour and a half, on the train. So I would just go into New York on weekends to play with them. Yeah, it was exciting. It was really exciting because there was this scene. Well, New York, I mean, there's always a bunch of scenes going on, but there's the entire Brooklyn kind of thing that I feel like that whole Brooklyn indie or Brooklyn DIY scene, I feel like it got national and international kind of people knew about it. People, became aware of it like in the late aughts, sort of, once it started to sort of, but it was really the early aughts when there was like a lot of this really experimental stuff was happening, so Z's was a part of that. So that was just super exciting to be like commuting into New York to just be on this part of this burgeoning thing,
What are some of the most important lessons that you learned from working with Z's?
Oh man, so much more than in college, I would say, for sure. And again, some of these lessons are not things that you would hear. They wouldn't be things that show up in my music now, as far as like literal, like direct aesthetics and stuff. But on a tech music level, I mean, I learned about just organizing pitch from Sam Hilmer a lot, and now, I mean, my stuff, it's so much simpler. There's so much more medieval influence. It's all just sort of stripped down to this modal kind of thing. But I mean, back then, I was writing very, very chromatic music, and I learned from him a lot about just making music that's atonal without being serious and without having systems, without having systems of composition, writing music that is atonal, but coming from a completely intuitively written by ear, not written by systems, but just, I mean, that's one thing, it just sort of weighs, And I learned on a less purely technical level, also on a technical level, I learned about just nailing really complex rhythms. Brax taught me about using rhythms that were crazy quintuplets. I've opened these kind of rhythms. This would be in student ensembles that would play Braxton's music. So the accuracy wasn't really enforced. I didn't have this experience of just working my fingers to the bone to nail this insane stuff. So it was really with Z's where I came in being like, okay, I know what this is about, a rhythm like this, but to rehearse with a band of the most, tightest, most virtuosic musicians I'd ever played with, just spending 20 minutes looping one measure, looping two beats to nail something with a group. I mean, there were I mean, I can remember one rehearsal. I can actually remember a specific rehearsal. I felt my standard of how killing a band has to be on the level of not just accuracy, but intensity and just gelling as an ensemble. I felt my standard suddenly level up to where I was like, I can't unknow this now. Like, I know what this is like now to play this tight, and I can't go back now, you know? That was it's like the opposite of trauma or something, you know, but it's like the positive version where you're like scarred by like knowing something too deep that you can't look away from. And I'll tell you, I bet you didn't expect I was going to go on this much of a tangent and stuff, but it's just such a really good question. One of these rehearsals that was so deep to me is was Alex Minchek. So he's like the other founding guy. The two founding guys of Z's were basically Sam Hilmer and Alex Minchek, right? They're like the two tenor saxophonists, right? And they were the two main composers at first before the rest of us started writing. And even when the rest of us started writing, we were really writing in the styles within concepts that they had sort of laid down, you know? And Minchek, who now is just a full-fledged, just classical, you know, highly successful classical composer of orchestral music. I remember he came in, he would write all his stuff out by hand. We all did at first. But I mean, he had these scores that you just couldn't believe a person wrote these by hand. I mean, you just couldn't even believe it. And he's just prolific with it. And I remember he came in with this piece, these huge 11/17 scores with these saxophone, like the most complex, like fully notated saxophone multiphonics, you know, fully controlled and deliberately determined fingerings and everything, doing these crazy multiphonics together. And I remember he plops this down and the guys start checking it out. And after a minute and a half, he was like, fuck, this isn't working, and just took it off the stand. It was just like, I'm rewriting this. He's like, I'm scrapping this, I'm rewriting it. That in and of itself was a lesson that I just will never forget, that, because, you know, to put in that much effort on something, obsessive effort on a thing, and then to just admit that it's not working, to just you know, to get your head out of the score, to get your head out of your head, get out of yourself, listen to it with the real aesthetic ears, and just be that honest with yourself, to be like, this sucks, I was wrong. I mean, that's deep. That's deep. To, you know, because we've all done something, and we've sort of convinced ourselves that, like, no, we could just follow through. It's like, you know, sunk cost, you know, sort of sunk cost idea, clinging on to some idea. He just threw it in the trash, or maybe he probably started over from zero and made something great. But I just that fucked me up, man. That was deep. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. So you really leveled up your work ethic working with Z's, is one way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had a crazy work ethic from just practicing, you know, because being a jazz musician in high school, it was kind of like, I realized pretty early on, like, okay, I'm not going to be a jazz musician. You know, I'm going to make some kind of more experimental, you know, weirder genreless music. But yeah, getting into jazz, that started off that work ethic, you know, just worshiping John Coltrane, not just as an artist, but just as a way of being as a musician, you know, that sort of ascetic building of the self. You know, you build what you are through repetitive action, and it's like prayer, you know, that sort of pseudo-religious kind of view of work ethic, you know. But yeah, Z's leveled it up because it kind of it was like that work ethic, but applied to aesthetics and like a type of music that I actually did want to do for my life, you know, and was actually relevant, and collectively doing it in rehearsal. I mean, that's what I had never done before, applying that kind of obsessive work to an actual band to level up, for sure.
Why did you leave Z's?
Well, I had just gotten to this point where I just wanted to do my own thing. I just was like, I want to lead a group, you know, and I had, you know, really become a singer. You know, I had like I had actually sung in some metal bands, you know, in early college and stuff. But you know, but it was only in Z's I started to integrate it a little with the sort of chanting, you know, vocal stuff. But really, I realized, I was like, you know what, I really am meant to be a singer, lead singer, write lyrics, you know, and be like the singer and guitar player. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't even like I wasn't even really I hadn't even really turned on I hadn't developed any kind of distaste for the aesthetic of Z's at all. And I certainly had zero problems with the guys. I think we were closer than ever at that point, especially me and Sam. But it just Z's was so all consuming. I mean, there's just this thing of just being in that band. I mean, it's just like this group. I mean, I couldn't really commit to doing my own thing and that. You know, I had to really just strike out on my own, just even time wise. You know, just even time commitment wise.
So I have to give you some credit here because I was fired from a band twice as a vocalist and as a potential second guitarist, knowing that you left Z's. And one of the reasons for doing so was because you needed to do your own thing. That really made me realize that I have to write my own music instead of rely on other people to give me something. And so that way I can't be fired from my own band. So thank you for that. It really inspired me at a time when I thought, oh shit, I have nothing left.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You can't get fired from your own thing. Yeah. It's yeah, it takes a thing to just be like, I have something that I want to bring out there rather than relying on other people to do it, you know, to bring it out of you. But of course, there's these different working processes, you know, for different bands, you know. I mean, like there's a million ways I mean, some of these bands that we were talking about, whether it was like Grand Ulena or some of the, well, actually, I don't know how they work, but just some of these sort of noisy weirdo rock bands that we were talking about. I mean, I know some of those bands, it's very collaborative writing, you know, there like really isn't one composer. Then with Z's, it was like individual, we would each individually write pieces as composers. So it was like a collective, but we would each write entire finished pieces ourselves. But the finished pieces that we write ourselves were kind of part of this hive mind of aesthetics, you know, so like sort of shared ideas, shared aesthetic ideas. So yeah, and then there's Extra Life. But even Extra Life, the process changed over the course of the band. You know what I mean? Because it started out, the first record was just I wrote everything and then assembled the musicians to play it note for note. Second record was like that, but the band got into a group with different people from the first record, and then they were a little bit bringing their own parts into it. Then Green's third record was like I wrote the songs, but they were parts. Kaylee and Nick were very much writing their parts, which mattered a lot, you know, for what the music actually was. So it changed over, you know, it changed over time. Yeah.
So in Extra Life, that shift from you as the sole composer to more of a typical band writing process, did that start around Made Flesh or the Ripped Heart EP?
It really deliberately started for Dream Seeds, like with that material, because Ripped Heart, those were pieces that I had written at the time as the Made Flesh stuff. Like I kind of cranked all of that out at the same time, and a couple things that I never even recorded or used. Yes, it was really on Dream Seeds. It was like, let's do a whole different approach for this.
So it's during this time with Extra Life that you start incorporating early music stylings, and especially like melisma, right? In terms of vocals.
Well, you know, there was actually this project that never really got around, that was only around for like a year. We played like 4 shows and only had 4 pieces, but this thing I did called Seductive Sprigs. I don't know if that ever came to around your ears. I mean, hardly anybody heard that, but that was me and Matt Huff, who at the time was the other guitar player for Z's. And that was duo. And that we did a ton of melisma. We were both singing together in harmony with these weird harmonies. That had like that went deeper into the early music stuff. That's Seductive Sprigs was how I learned. I did a lot of practicing just singing in tune. You know, I wasn't really developing as a stylist, you know, because it was me and Matt singing together. So I wasn't really forming myself as a sort of having an individual sort of vibe to my voice, but I was us just spending a year getting the most complex stuff on earth in tune was sort of a chops thing vocally. So that's why when I started doing Extra Life, I was already kind of, well, I'd say I was already kind of good at singing, but I listen back to Secular Works and I'm like, it's out of tune, you know. But that's always how it is when you listen back to your own voice. But yeah, Extra Life is where that medieval stuff really, because I'd been listening to a ton of that in college, and Z's guys were way into early music. Sam Hilmer put me on to tons of that stuff.
So with like the Extra Life track Bled White, which is one of my favorites, by the way, thank you for that. Was that written like on paper or yeah, I guess was that written on paper and then you're like, all right, I have to learn how to sing this motherfucker.
That's a cool question, and I can't exactly remember. I think that, well, I definitely wrote the lyrics first. I remember being on a plane to Chicago and like kind of in my head, kind of tossing around the first couple phrases. I think I probably wrote that by ear, just not on paper, but I know I didn't write it like all in, like just in a second, like spitting it out, like boom, there it is. I definitely spent some time like fiddling with, is this gonna go up or down or like, so I think it had sort of the same sort of the sort of careful, like taking a little bit of time, kind of approach that one would have with writing stuff on paper. I mean, when you're dealing with one line, I mean, it's just one vocal line. It's not like counterpoint or big chords or anything. If it's really just one line, I mean, notation becomes a little less necessary. I mean, like you just keep singing it back in your head.
Did you ever perform that song live?
Yeah, I can't remember when though. Probably some encore in Europe where people have enough, like attention span to actually pay attention to like, yeah, it definitely wasn't, like a fixture in the set at any point. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I only had an opportunity to see Extra Life once. This was in July 2012 in Chicago at the now defunct Swert Mansion. And yeah, it was an amazing show. I'm so glad I got to see you guys play.
Nice. I'm glad you did too. Thanks for the good words. Yeah.
Tell me about the history of Psalm Zero. Like, when did that start up? When did you and Andrew
Psalm
Hawk
Zero
decide to form that?
Psalm Zero started. I mean, basically, Extra Life. I wanted to end Extra Life really just because there were certain aesthetic things that had sort of accrued around the name that that I just wanted to cut off, from the past, and I wanted to do something that was way more metal-ish. I mean, basically my vibe was like, me and Nick and Kaylee and I were, totally close. There was never any problem with either of them, and they're just so incredible. I miss playing with those guys. We'll see.
Ooh.
Yeah, I was right. I was like, basically, I was like, all right, my new path is that I don't want to have a band. I don't want to do a thing where my weird composer side is also a band that goes around and tours. I was saying to myself, I wanted all my super weird idiosyncratic stuff I want to do as a composer, applying for grants, applying for commissions, residencies, etc. That kind of thing. Like I was like, I wanted to be a quote unquote classical composer, and my whole Extra Life stuff is going to go into that because I was getting, I was starting to get some offers in that field. And I was like, as far as a band, I want to do something as simple as possible. And I just want to do like a dark rock band. I mean, it was almost like a punk vibe. I mean, like I was just kind of like I didn't even picture it really being my main thing. I thought like, well, if this takes off, obviously we'll kind of pursue the taking off, you know what I mean? But I really envisioned it as being this other thing that is way simpler and just kind of scrappy almost, and Andrew was around a lot, and I was getting really into Castavet, his band before that, his black metal band. And I was just really into his playing. Yeah, just our social circles were kind of like merging, and we were hanging out a lot. And so yeah, so I wrote a bunch of songs, but they weren't all fleshed out, and there were they were open. So I was like, okay, Andrew, I want to get Andrew's input on some of this stuff. And once we started working on it, his voice came more, really came out, and he started actually like really writing stuff that like entire parts of stuff, like entire riffs and stuff. So yeah, that's how that kind of started. There's also a certain nihilism too, just in the sense I was sort of starting to like not be doing well in certain aspects of my life, and I sort of bonded with Andrew. There was this sense of there was this sympathy that he was in this place of negativity, that doing this very dark sort of metal based industrial based thing was sort of this expression of that, But of course, once you get going, you go into something being like, yeah, this is going to just be pure darkness, pure fuck it, whatever. Of course, once we get going, it becomes very crafted and we start doing all the little harmonic choices and it becomes very composery. It's like I can't not be a nerd, I can't. It always has to end up being. Yeah. I mean, so that's how Psalm Zero started.
So, as a nerd with an academic background in music, what do you think about and I'm not sure if this is a word, but the academicization of popular music forms? For example, jazz, hip hop, and now even metal. Like, what is there a broader meaning to this, and like, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I actually didn't really know that rap music and metal were actually entering into academia. Is that right? I mean, can you go to conservatory and study like emceeing and stuff? Or
So like I haven't done, well, I should have done more research into this, but like I don't know how deep the programs are, but like you can take college courses that focus around like the study of, and I think like the performance of hip hop. Metal, I think that's still
okay,
much earlier on.
yeah, because I know that a lot of very serious jazz musicians and classical composers are more and more understanding metal because there's so much technical. I mean, there's so much compositional kind of ambition in metal. Even if it's not like so-called tech metal, even if you're just talking about like old school death metal. I mean, there's just so much in a Cryptopsy song. I mean, it's absolutely is like modernist composition of a sort. Yeah, I mean, as far as things becoming more academic, I don't know because I haven't. I mean, I can say with jazz, I mean that's been since the 70s, as far as I can tell. Seems that right? It seems like the 70s is when you could first go to conservatory for jazz. I think that's when those programs started. Yeah, it's definitely changed. It's definitely changed what that music is. I mean, what the culture is, how it's perceived, its role in the world, in culture. I suppose there's a way that things get legitimized, and but then on some level become taken out of the world or something. There's a lot of conservatism within jazz programs that recreating the past and whatnot, developing formalized ways of teaching that music. I think there's been a real effort to make jazz into like quote unquote America's classical music, right? I mean, over the past several decades, there's been a thing to just be like, these are our Beethovens and our Mozarts, our Miles Davis and John Coltrane, Yeah, I can't speak against that because that's a beautiful thing and a beautiful idea, and it's true, And there's an important kind of racial politics to that of, just elevating, accepting, great Black art as being like the great American music, So I feel like, I don't know. It seems like the academicization or whatever of jazz has that as a positive impulse, right?
Yeah.
You can definitely criticize how it's affected maybe the music itself long term. I'm not sure. Yeah. I'll tell you though, I like the way, as far as classical music, so-called contemporary music, new music, whatever you want to call it, like post-European, like that tradition, the way in which that has been completely cloistered into academia, I like that. I think that's actually cool. Like one of the things I like about hyper complex post-European, post-European makes it sound like Europe is over, which is also really funny to me. So that's why I say post-European. But right, it's like, yeah, it's like you had a good run. See ya. No, but like I one of the things I love about that music is that it's this weird ivory tower stuff that just hardly anyone even knows about. And it's just shrunk down. It's like really cult. I like that actually about it. I don't think that's ruining it, because that's just the place for it, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just that lineage of music went from what? I mean, it went from the church, to the salon, right? Or the court. Yeah, it went from the church to like the king's court, and then to like I guess the bourgeois class, I guess you would say. I don't know, like the sort of salons, at the height of I don't know, like classical music. And then and then it becomes and then it becomes the university, like in the 20th century. I'm fine with it.
That's a very interesting take. Like it requires a certain level of elitism in order to stay alive, basically. That someone has to care about it that much.
Yeah, yeah.
And it requires like keeping it encapsulated. That's interesting. That's cool.
Well, it literally requires classical music. I mean, it literally requires resources. I mean, literally just amounts of money, in order to live. Because just to make music that's this certain level of technical complexity, I mean, you literally have to just have time on your hands. You need to have a wealthy patron, paying for you to just do that, or you have to have the church funding you to just write music all day, I mean, essentially, and and same thing with academic music. You need the university, and to hire all the musicians. You know what I mean? I mean, it is very expensive, especially since classical musicians, I mean, they don't, when it comes to rates and fees, I mean, they don't play. They need they need money. So if you want to hire the top level ensembles, you need like money from either academia or from like arts institutions, funding streams, endowments, or whatever. So I mean, this is what makes it almost kind of like more, especially impressive, like coming back to these kind of like hyper complex rock based. It's almost funny to say rock, but like DIY guitar, like electric guitar based hardcore metal, whatever, rooted bands who make music as complex as like this Grand Ulena or whoever we're talking about. There's like people with day jobs coming home and doing this in the evenings. I mean, that's kind of mind blowing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I actually can't believe, that I managed to find time to do a lot of that Z stuff in a DIY context. But, I've had tons of help from my parents and like inherited money and like various, you know what I mean? I'm not out here flapping in the breeze, hand to mouth. If I were, I would have probably made far less complex music because you just have less time and resources and you got to just get to it. Yeah. So that whole, So, I mean, this is with jazz or these other kinds of music. That requires time and therefore resources. That stuff blows my mind too, though, because these classic jazz artists, I mean, when you're talking about the 60s and 50s, I don't understand how some of these guys were practicing 6 hours a day, because they weren't, I mean, I guess they were making a little bit of money playing gigs and then just not eating much and just literally starving artist style. I don't know how. I guess you could make some money as a jazz musician, right? Like not a good living, but you could survive just playing a couple of sets a night, and I guess then you could practice all day. Maybe that's how
I guess
that
so.
was going down.
Tell me about your relationship with the comedy of Patrice O'Neill and how that factors into your album Simple Answers. Rest in peace, Patrice.
Yo, rest in peace. I love you've really checked out the catalog, man. I appreciate that, Dave. I mean, so now we're not really talking about, we were talking about all these specifics, the technical specifics of music. And then now we're talking about these sort of poetic aspects of the, the sort of lyrical concerns. Patrice is able to articulate things that are considered evil. And that I suppose I consider evil when I encounter in certain forms, certain forms of, I mean, to say misogyny, like that's almost like too narrow, to even describe what I'm talking about, because I'm really more talking about just, I guess you could say cruelty, or just sort of the arrogance of power, some kind of belief in power as being like a motivating, like the fundamental motivating, force behind human affairs, like before love or anything, everything being based on just power. So, for simple answers, it really boils down to just the extent to which I am uncomfortable with that, but fascinated by that as an idea, and sort of to some extent haunted by it, wrestling with it. I think anyone who's honest on any psychological level is wrestling with that sort of layer of reality, because if that's all you think the human experience is, then you're like an animal. I mean, I guess, but if you deny that, then you're really not being real about what it means to be a person. But I mean, I guess just the way that he can take things that are considered evil and actually bring them into this human realm where it's people really do laugh. I mean, he really spread joy, with points of view that are considered mean. They're mean, but he spreads joy and made people laugh. You'd see people walking out of his shows, in some of these videos, they'd be walking
Yeah.
out. He's not making people cry. He's not really causing damage. So I don't know. There was just this certain self-awareness and humanness about him, that he could make people laugh at stuff that you would you wouldn't expect that certain people would laugh at. I know people who find him hilarious who I really was like, wow, you really think he's funny? Because I know I do, but I'm like, people who I would expect to be disgusted, people who I just would expect to have no patience for that kind of that kind of attitude. But somebody, I can't remember who said, but someone on Twitter said, anytime you make somebody laugh against their will, you've won. So I appreciated that's that standpoint, right? I mean, that's sort of where he's coming from. But yeah, so simple answers, I suppose, was sort of me lyrically kind of, is very like 2015, 2016. It came out 2018, but 2015, 2016 is when I was writing this music, and I was seeing the sort of Trump phenomenon bubbling up. But even more than politics, I don't get into politics at all in the sense of policy and like literally actual like grown up politics, but I'm hyper political in the sense of the issue, the cultural like issues and the currents and the thoughts and what's going on with people. So I was witnessing that whole sort of 4chan sort of culture, the troll culture, the edgelord culture, and the sincere far right culture as well, is sort of concurrent and confluent with that. So I sort of, Patrice for me was this sort of defining point where I'm like, okay, this guy represents a point where I get where this stuff is coming from, even though I am in so many ways against what I'm seeing. I'm personally threatened in many ways by what I'm seeing, rising up. But Patrice was sort of like this pivot point where I'm like, okay, this is me understand, this is something that I actually laugh at, that is sort of like in that realm, so he represented a sort of limit point, I suppose, for me. But the thing is, so much of that troll stuff, man, so much of that culture just isn't funny, or wasn't. I mean, it's sort of that wave is kind of crested. Now we're dealing with different stuff online, but I that whole movement, so much of it was like, haha, edgy humor. Like, we're like Opie and Anthony, we're like Patrice. And it's just like, no, man, you guys aren't actually funny. You actually are just people with problems that need to be resolved. And it's not funny, so in any case, yes, I don't know.
So over the course of your career, you worked in different styles and genres. So do you think that your body of work will have a defined end goal? Is there like some sort of summary statement or aesthetic that you think you're trying to achieve?
No, I wouldn't say, because I've made these breaks. Well, I mean, it would be cool to think that when I'm done, that my body of work will be visible enough or remembered enough. It would be cool to think that it'll be remembered enough that there will be people who in their minds try to tie it up in a bow, and that it all was about something, or that, but I'm not going to be grandiose and presumptuous, to assume that that there will be, books written about, so as far as what my own intention with stuff is, no, I don't. I mean, in fact, I've always had a certain aversion to the way, especially in the classical sphere and in the new music sphere, the academic composer sphere, it's always rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, the way composers in that world, they always have to have these artist statements that it's not their fault. You have to have these kind of statements in order to get the money. But this thing where you have to be like, my work is concerned with blah, blah, blah. And in these various projects I've explored it, it's all extensions of this thing that I'm about. It's like, I know that for some people that's like a cool sense of conceptual clarity and self-awareness, but I really think that it really seems to me like people are compelled to lock themselves into boxes and overly define this overly determined sort of sense of what you're about, that I think there's something inartistic about it because I really think that contradicting yourself is actually a part of integrity. I think that a certain inconsistency is actually more real in a way than really knowing what you're about. But on the other hand, I would never sit down and on a macro level tell you what I'm going for, but I love talking about on a micro level, just individual, sort of case by case, like, oh, this record was about that, or like, oh, this song was about that. I like looking back and reflecting and being like, I guess I actually was doing XYZ. I thought I was doing this, but I actually was doing that. I'm into self-awareness, self-analysis, but I can't. There's no overall goal with this, really. I just, the goal is to just build up a body of work, have everything be as powerful as possible. I often get motivated, like I was about to say, like I get on these breaks. Without overly, getting overly specific, with starting Psalm Zero, there were just things about Extra Life where I was like, fuck that, no more. I cringe when I listen to those aspects. Like, I'm done with that, And then I do Psalm Zero, and after a few years, now I'm looking back in these Extra Life elements. I'm like, I miss that, man. That actually is a very big part of what I'm about. So, but it's like, I mean, it's the Psalm Zero is also is an expression of where I'm at. Psalm Zero has changed, especially after the fallout with Andrew, and then the last record is the most recent record is different because it's just me completely on my own. With Ron and Keith from KO playing, but it's really, I mean, they wrote their parts, but really it's it's like my writing. Yeah, that record's totally different. I kept the name Psalm Zero because it has a ton in common with the work I did with Andrew, but it's different because he's gone. Even the stuff that I'm writing for that is an influence and a continuation of stuff that Andrew and I worked together, so he rubbed off on me musically, as much as I hate to give that guy any credit, but it's like, in any case, who needs to go there, but yeah. So I think if I locked into some overall mission of what I'm about, that actually helps your career because repetition builds reputation. But I get sick of stuff. I zigzag around. I keep it moving.
So I want to be mindful of your time and give you just a few more questions. So
yeah, that's cool.
As someone who, in your non-medical professional estimation, do you think bands will get around to touring later this year?
I have no idea. I'm really trying to I remain so agnostic about so much of this stuff. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know what to believe. My okay, I'm not gonna make this a huge tangent. My distrust of what I get told by all media outlets, all of them, including the most mainstream, my distrust has reached this level of paranoia that is on. I'm as crazy about it as those QAnon people are. I do not believe their specific, the specific things that they think are happening, I don't think are happening. And I don't believe in specific conspiracy theories on the level of people deliberately lying or deliberately, trying to do something nefarious. But I have an immense distrust about just the accuracy of what I'm being told, because people just change. They change the story. Top medical professionals don't agree. It's not even COVID, just in general. Top medical professionals, when you really get into any field and you see the lack of consensus among top professionals, it's actually scary to me how little people actually are sure. So I'm already off on a tangent. No, I'm not sure. I'm going to say I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
About touring.
What's the last song that you had stuck in your head? And when you get a song stuck in your head, are you compelled to learn to play it on guitar to get it out of your head?
Oh, that's funny. I'm not necessarily compelled to get it out of my head off the by playing it on guitar. What's the last song? I mean, that would have been like the past couple of days, but I can't remember. That song Rain by Madonna from like the early 90s Madonna era, which I really like. I've always liked her songs, or or the songwriters that she was working with, back in that period. So yeah, my friend Jeremiah played Rain for me over when we were Zoom chatting and stuff, and I hadn't heard it in forever, and that really got stuck with me. So yeah, not much to play on guitar with that song, but
Oh, I skipped one question. Tell me about your new record coming up with Jeremiah Zimmerman.
Yeah, well, that's the good question to ask. That record is it's duo. Yeah, Jeremiah's playing clarinet and electronics as he always does. I am and studio stuff. He did manipulation and produced it. So that's actually a lot of what's going on. Yeah, and I played guitar and piano. It's actually a return to my engagement with improvised music, because that's the thing. I had said that I was saying that that my background in jazz and improvised music, that's sort of not evident in quote unquote what I do now, or quote unquote my body of work. But really what I meant is that it's not the background in jazz and improv. It's not present or evident in my main bands and stuff that people have heard, but I've actually been, over the years consistently having these little side projects like that deal with improvisation. I had this thing for years called Period, which was me and Mike Pride and Chuck Bettis, if you know those guys at all. And that was all improvised. But so this thing with Jeremiah, I mean, we've just been like great friends for so long, and so it was just time to make a duo record. So it's improvised. So you get a chance to hear me playing guitar and piano, no vocals. Improvising with vocals I've never done, and I have no interest in doing that. But it's very minimal music. It's very dark, and it doesn't use drones. People always use the word droney incorrectly, but people will call this droney because it's static and still, and deals with just like one note a lot. There's a lot of Chelsea in there. You a fan of Chelsea?
I'm not familiar.
Oh man, I mean, if you're a modern classical head, Scelsi, Giacinto Chelsea. He was kind of like I guess he was writing from the 60s to the 90s, maybe even the 50s. But his stuff, it's very like one note with like a lot of microtones and then other weird stuff coming off of it. It's very obsessive and dark and bleak. And so this is kind of some of that. And then the tiny little moments of almost klezmerish sounding stuff from Jeremiah. So February 5th, that comes out.
But you were saying February 5th is when the record comes out.
Yeah, February 5th, the record comes out. It's called A Horizon Made of Canvas. Jeremiah Zimmerman, Charlie Looker duo. And the label that put it out, Astral Spirits, is really cool if you're interested in sort of like new wave of improvised music and sort of like free jazz, but very contemporary. They put out a Roscoe Mitchell record, which is really exciting. So that's a we're psyched to be on that label. We're in really good company. So yeah, check that out.
Where can people hear your music?
Charlie Looker at Bandcamp. Charlie Looker Bandcamp is the way to go. But it's Charlie Looker Music at Bandcamp, and you can also, dude, what am I doing? No, yes, Charlie Looker Music Bandcamp. And that's got all my projects actually. Yeah, that's got Simple Answers, Psalm Zero, all the stuff. And also anyone that's listening, check out my YouTube. It's called Last Things YouTube, but it's under my name, Charlie Looker, on YouTube.
Charlie, thank you so much for chatting with me. This took a lot of awesome, weird tangents. This is great.
Oh yeah, man, Dave, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, you asked great questions too. It's the tangents can only happen when the questions are good, man. So I appreciate it.